When we talk about narcissism, we often focus on charm, confidence, and grandiosity, especially in youth. But there is a less discussed, deeply destabilizing reality that emerges with time. For many narcissistic individuals, sexuality was never about intimacy, connection, or mutuality. It functioned as power. It was entitlement. It was proof of dominance, desirability, and control. Sexual access became a primary regulator of self-worth and a shortcut to validation, not a shared emotional experience. As aging sets in, something profound happens. The external markers that once sustained the narcissistic identity, attention, sexual availability, admiration, and perceived desirability, begin to fade. Bodies change, social leverage shifts, cultural tolerance for entitlement narrows, and for someone whose identity was propped up by sexual validation, this loss can feel catastrophic. What collapses is not just access to sex, but the illusion of omnipotence that sex once symbolized. This is where the concept of sexual entitlement becomes critical. Many narcissistic individuals internalize the belief that admiration, access, and desire were owed to them indefinitely. When that entitlement is no longer reinforced by the environment, the narcissistic structure becomes fragile. Shame, rage, bitterness, and desperation often rush in to fill the void. The issue is not aging itself, but what aging exposes an identity built on extraction rather than connection. This is not a moral judgment, and it is not about shaming sexuality. This is a clinical discussion about patterns, how narcissistic supply works, how validation substitutes for identity, and why loss of sexual power can trigger profound dysregulation. Understanding this process offers clarity, not cruelty. It helps explain why some narcissistic individuals unravel with age, why their behavior may intensify or deteriorate, and why awareness is essential for anyone affected by these dynamics. For many narcissistic individuals, sexuality is not experienced as desire or mutual connection, but as a central pillar of identity. It becomes evidence of worth, superiority, and relevance. When sexual access comes easily in early life, whether through physical attractiveness, social status, charm, or manipulation, it can quietly replace the slower work of developing emotional intimacy, self-reflection, and internal stability. Over time, sex is no longer something they experience, it is something they use to define who they are. In narcissistic structures, identity is externally anchored. Self-worth is not generated internally through values, empathy, or resilience, but regulated through feedback from others. Sexual validation is particularly potent because it delivers admiration, power, and confirmation all at once. Being desired does not just feel good, it signals dominance. It reassures the narcissistic individual that they are exceptional, chosen, and above others. This is where entitlement begins to take shape, not as desire, but as expectation. Entitlement forms when access is repeatedly reinforced without accountability. If a young narcissistic individual learns that charm overrides boundaries, that admiration excuses exploitation, or that desirability grants permission to objectify others, a dangerous equation develops. Sex becomes proof of immunity from limits. Over time, this entitlement hardens into belief. I deserve access. I am owed desire. I should never be rejected. Emotional intimacy, which requires vulnerability and reciprocity, becomes unnecessary and even threatening. Rather than relating to partners as whole people, narcissistic individuals often experience them as mirrors. Bodies become symbols. Desire becomes currency. validation becomes regulation. Sexual encounters are less about closeness and more about restoring equilibrium, calming insecurity, inflating grandiosity, or silencing shame. This is why sex can feel compulsive rather than connective in narcissistic dynamics. It is used to manage the self, not to bond with another. This pattern aligns closely with core narcissistic traits. Grandiosity transforms sexual attention into confirmation of superiority. Entitlement reframes consent as obligation. Objectification reduces partners to functions rather than individuals. When these traits are rewarded early, they rarely self-correct. Instead, they become more rigid with time. The narcissistic individual does not learn flexibility or emotional nuance. They learn repetition. What once worked becomes the only strategy. As years pass, sexual entitlement becomes deeply fused with identity. The narcissistic individual may not consciously think, sex defines me, but their emotional stability tells the story. Rejection feels annihilating. Aging feels humiliating. Competition feels threatening. Any disruption to sexual access is experienced not as a situational change, but as an existential injury. This is the fragility beneath the confidence. The identity was never diversified. Because this identity is externally maintained, it requires constant confirmation. One partner is rarely enough. One relationship rarely stabilizes. Sexual validation must be refreshed, escalated, or replaced. This is why boredom, infidelity, and devaluation are common patterns. It is not novelty seeking for pleasure, but desperation for regulation. Without new validation, the narcissistic self begins to wobble. Crucially, emotional intimacy does not develop alongside this entitlement. Vulnerability threatens the illusion of control. Empathy dilutes dominance. Mutuality exposes dependency. As a result, the narcissistic individual may actively avoid deeper connection while still demanding closeness on their own terms. They want access without accountability, admiration without reciprocity, desire without attachment. This imbalance feels normal to them because it has always been rewarded. Over time, this creates an identity that is powerful on the surface and hollow underneath. There is no internal sense of being lovable beyond performance, no stable self beyond desirability, no emotional anchor beyond attention. Aging does not create this fragility, it reveals it. When access becomes less automatic and competition increases, the old strategies no longer produce the same results. This is where rigidity becomes dangerous. Instead of adapting, many narcissistic individuals double down. They cling more tightly to entitlement. They externalize blame. They shame others for no longer responding. They may pursue increasingly risky, degrading, or transactional sexual experiences, not for pleasure, but to prove that they still have it. The goal is not intimacy, but restoration of identity. Psychologically, this is the cost of building a self around extraction rather than connection. When youth provides easy validation, it can delay emotional development. The narcissistic individual never has to ask who they are without admiration. They never learn how to tolerate rejection, aging, or equality. Sexual entitlement becomes a shortcut that bypasses growth. What looks like confidence in youth is often dependency in disguise. The identity depends on being wanted, not known, desired, not understood. When that desire becomes conditional or scarce, the narcissistic structure destabilizes rapidly. Shame floods in where grandiosity once lived. Rage replaces charm. Control attempts intensify as regulation fails. Understanding this pattern is essential because it explains why aging can be so psychologically disruptive for narcissistic individuals. The loss is not just sexual access, but identity coherence. When sexuality was never about desire, but about proof, Its disappearance leaves behind a terrifying question. The narcissistic individual is structurally unprepared to answer, "Who am I without this validation?" This is where the concept of sexual entitlement becomes critical. Many narcissistic individuals internalize the belief that admiration, access, and desire were owed to them indefinitely. When that entitlement is no longer reinforced by the environment, the narcissistic structure becomes fragile. Shame, rage, bitterness, and desperation often rush in to fill the void. The issue is not aging itself, but what aging exposes, an identity built on extraction rather than connection. This is not a moral judgment, and it is not about shaming sexuality. This is a clinical discussion about patterns, how narcissistic supply works, how validation substitutes for identity, and why loss of sexual power can trigger profound dysregulation. Understanding this process offers clarity, not cruelty. It helps explain why some narcissistic individuals unravel with age, why their behavior may intensify or deteriorate, and why awareness is essential for anyone affected by these dynamics. For individuals with narcissistic traits, aging often lands not as a natural life transition, but as a psychological injury. This is especially true for those who relied heavily on sexual access, desirability, and attention to regulate their sense of self. In these cases, aging does not simply bring physical change, it disrupts an entire system of validation that once functioned automatically. What was once effortless now requires pursuit, explanation, or negotiation, and that shift can feel deeply destabilizing. In healthy personalities, aging is integrated gradually. There may be grief about change, but identity is not dependent on being admired, pursued, or sexually prioritized. Self-worth comes from multiple sources: values, relationships, competence, meaning. For narcissistic individuals, however, identity is often narrowly constructed. When desirability and attention decline, there is little else to stabilize the self. Aging exposes how much was resting on external reinforcement rather than internal cohesion. This is why aging can feel humiliating rather than neutral. The narcissistic individual may experience reduced attention as rejection, invisibility as abandonment, and normal bodily changes as evidence of worthlessness. These experiences activate deep shame, even if that shame is quickly defended against through anger, contempt, or denial. The loss is not just of youth, but of dominance. Sexual leverage once allowed the narcissistic individual to command interest, set terms, and feel superior. As that leverage weakens, the illusion of control begins to fracture. Cultural dynamics often intensify this injury. Many societies glorify youth, desirability, and sexual relevance, especially for those who once benefited from these currencies. When the environment no longer responds with admiration or deference, the narcissistic individual feels betrayed by reality itself. They may externalize this pain by blaming younger people, shaming partners, or railing against cultural shifts rather than confronting the internal emptiness that is being revealed. Importantly, aging does not create narcissistic dysfunction. It functions as a mirror. It reveals what was always there but successfully defended against. When attention declines, the narcissistic individual is forced into contact with feelings they never learned to tolerate: insignificance, dependency, vulnerability. Healthy personalities can sit with these emotions, integrate them, and adapt. Narcissistic structures, by contrast, are built to avoid them at all costs. As sexual access becomes less automatic, many narcissistic individuals experience a sharp increase in dysregulation. They may become more irritable, bitter, or controlling. They may engage in desperate attempts to recapture validation, seeking much younger partners, exaggerating achievements, pursuing cosmetic changes, or engaging in risky or transactional sexual behavior. These actions are not about pleasure or connection, but about restoring a collapsing sense of self. Declining attention also disrupts narrative identity. The story the narcissistic individual told themselves about being exceptional, irresistible, or above the rules no longer aligns with feedback from the world. This discrepancy creates cognitive and emotional strain. Rather than revising the story, many double down on it. They insist they are still owed desire, still entitled to access, still superior. When reality does not comply, rage and resentment often follow. There is also a profound fear embedded in this stage: invisibility. For someone whose existence felt confirmed through being seen, wanted, and pursued, fading into the background can feel like psychological erasure. This fear is not always conscious. It may appear as contempt for others, obsession with status, or constant comparison. Aging threatens the narcissistic individual with something they were never prepared to face: being ordinary, interchangeable, or unnecessary. Compassion is essential here, but so is clarity. The pain experienced is real, but it is rooted in an identity structure that was never sustainable. Aging destabilizes narcissistic identity more severely because that identity lacked flexibility. There was no internal buffer, no capacity to self-soothe without admiration, no relational depth to compensate for lost attention. What collapses is not youth, but a fragile scaffolding built on entitlement and extraction. In healthier personalities, aging often brings a shift toward meaning, legacy, and deeper connection. There is an ability to mourn what is lost while investing in what remains. Narcissistic individuals struggle with this shift because it requires relinquishing hierarchy and embracing equality. It requires moving from being desired to being known, from being powerful to being present. These are skills that were never developed. As the old strategies fail, the narcissistic individual may feel increasingly cornered. Control attempts escalate because regulation is failing. Sexual validation no longer works the way it once did. Attention no longer anesthetizes insecurity. Aging forces a confrontation with the self that was always avoided. It is not punishment and it is not tragedy, it is exposure. And for someone whose identity depended on never being exposed, this can feel unbearable, leaving them grasping for relevance, control, and proof that they still matter in a world that no longer mirrors back the illusion they once lived inside. This is where the concept of sexual entitlement becomes critical. Many narcissistic individuals internalize the belief that admiration, access, and desire were owed to them indefinitely. When that entitlement is no longer reinforced by the environment, the narcissistic structure becomes fragile. Shame, rage, bitterness, and desperation often rush in to fill the void. The issue is not aging itself, but what aging exposes: an identity built on extraction rather than connection. This is not a moral judgment, and it is not about shaming sexuality. This is a clinical discussion about patterns, how narcissistic supply works, how validation substitutes for identity, and why loss of sexual power can trigger profound dysregulation. Understanding this process offers clarity, not cruelty. It helps explain why some narcissistic individuals unravel with age, why their behavior may intensify or deteriorate, and why awareness is essential for anyone affected by these dynamics. When sexual supply has functioned as a primary regulator of mood and self-esteem, its loss can trigger profound emotional dysregulation. For many aging narcissistic individuals, sex was never simply an activity or a form of closeness. It was a stabilizing mechanism. It soothed insecurity, inflated self-image, and provided a sense of control over others and over internal chaos. When that stabilizer weakens or disappears, the psychological system that depended on it begins to wobble. Sexual supply works as external regulation in narcissistic structures. Instead of internally processing stress, disappointment, or self-doubt, the narcissistic individual relied on being desired to restore equilibrium. Sexual attention quieted shame. Access confirmed superiority. Being wanted meant being safe from insignificance. Over time, this association becomes automatic. When sex is available, the narcissistic individual feels calmer, more confident, more entitled. When it is not, dysregulation sets in quickly. As aging disrupts access to sexual validation, emotions that were long avoided come rushing to the surface. Irritability increases, patience thins. There may be a constant low-grade anger that has no obvious cause. This anger is often misdirected outward because turning inward would require confronting dependency and emptiness. Rage becomes a defense against shame, and bitterness becomes a way to make sense of loss without accepting vulnerability. One common response is resentment. Aging narcissists may frame the loss of sexual access as something being taken from them rather than something changing naturally. Partners are accused of withholding. Society is blamed for becoming superficial or unfair. Younger people are resented for possessing what the narcissistic individual believes they still deserve. This resentment functions as a protective story. It preserves entitlement by casting the world as wrong rather than the identity as fragile. Control behaviors often escalate in this phase. When internal regulation fails, external control becomes more urgent. This may show up as sexual coercion, pressure, guilt tripping, or emotional manipulation designed to extract reassurance or access. Consent becomes blurred because the narcissistic individual experiences sexual validation as necessary rather than optional. From their perspective, the partner is not exercising autonomy but threatening stability. Jealousy also intensifies as sexual supply diminishes. The narcissistic individual may become hypervigilant about perceived rivals, especially younger or more desirable people. This jealousy is not rooted in attachment insecurity in the traditional sense, but in fear of replacement and erasure. If someone else is desired, it confirms the narcissistic individual's worst fear, that they are no longer special, no longer central, no longer powerful. Obsession with youth is another predictable shift. Youth represents the period when sexual supply was abundant and effortless. Fixation on younger partners, youthful appearance, or nostalgic fantasies is less about attraction and more about time travel. It is an attempt to reclaim a version of the self that felt regulated and dominant. When reality resists this attempt, frustration and despair can deepen. Blame becomes a primary coping strategy. Rather than recognizing sexual dysregulation as an internal dependency issue, the narcissistic individual externalizes responsibility. Partners are accused of being cold, ungrateful, or manipulative. Aging bodies are resented as betrayals. Cultural norms are attacked for no longer prioritizing them. This blame protects the grandiose self-image by preventing insight into emotional reliance on sexual supply. What often goes unrecognized is how destabilizing the absence of sex can feel internally. Without this familiar regulator, the narcissistic individual may experience mood swings, anxiety, depression, or a sense of internal chaos. These states are deeply uncomfortable because they were never learned to be tolerated. Instead of sitting with distress, the narcissistic individual looks for immediate relief, often through control, aggression, or compulsive seeking of validation. This dysregulation can make relationships feel increasingly unsafe. Partners may notice increased hostility, entitlement, or emotional volatility tied specifically to sexual dynamics. Requests for intimacy become demands. Boundaries are experienced as attacks. Any refusal is interpreted as rejection or humiliation. The underlying driver is not desire, but desperation to reestablish emotional balance through familiar means. It is important to emphasize that these reactions are patterned, not accidental. They reflect a long-standing dependency on external regulation rather than a sudden personality change. Aging removes the buffer that once masked this dependency. When sexual supply no longer performs its regulatory function, the narcissistic individual is forced into contact with feelings they were structurally unprepared to manage. Healthy individuals also experience frustration, grief, or loss as sexual dynamics change with age, but they have alternative ways to regulate emotion. They can seek connection, meaning, or self-soothing without requiring validation from another's desire. Narcissistic individuals lack this flexibility. Their emotional system was built around extraction rather than integration. As a result, loss of sexual supply often leads not to quiet adjustment, but to escalation. Anger replaces charm. Control replaces confidence. Bitterness replaces entitlement. These shifts can feel confusing or alarming to those around them, but they make sense when viewed through the lens of dependency. When the primary regulator fails, the system reacts as though it is under threat. Understanding this pattern offers clarity without cruelty. The behaviors that emerge are not random acts of malice, but desperate attempts to restore equilibrium in an identity that was never internally stabilized. Aging simply removes the anesthetic, leaving the raw dependency exposed and the individual scrambling to manage emotions they were never taught to hold on their own. This is where the concept of sexual entitlement becomes critical. Many narcissistic individuals internalize the belief that admiration, access, and desire were owed to them indefinitely. When that entitlement is no longer reinforced by the environment, the narcissistic structure becomes fragile. Shame, rage, bitterness, and desperation often rush in to fill the void. The issue is not aging itself, but what aging exposes, an identity built on extraction rather than connection. This is not a moral judgment, and it is not about shaming sexuality. This is a clinical discussion about patterns, how narcissistic supply works, how validation substitutes for identity, and why loss of sexual power can trigger profound dysregulation. Understanding this process offers clarity, not cruelty. It helps explain why some narcissistic individuals unravel with age, why their behavior may intensify or deteriorate, and why awareness is essential for anyone affected by these dynamics.